Okay, great. I think we've got a resolution. Okay, super. Apologies for the technical glitch. We can proceed, and I'll move through this slides at pace so we can give time for the other speakers who have contributions as well. Okay, so if we could move. Okay, yeah, as I said, things are changing pretty quickly, and really, it's particularly critical that we find a way to navigate the future and sales and marketing in particular. We need to adapt quickly, and data is one of the key to help us to adapt. And I'm going to use a case study with this extensive study to explain how and what we can learn from it and why data is ultra critical. So I'd mentioned about that data is as old as humanity. Its use has become more sophisticated, however, and you see the example here of the ancient Egyptians using data as a way of understanding climate and managing the agricultural cycle. So data is not new. And in fact, one of the best stories around using innovation and being innovative in the way of gathering data was a story that an executive told me during a trip to Lagos a decade or so ago. So what we have here is a series of numbers. And when you look at these numbers, they are data. There's no insight. And because there's no insight, there's no story. And really, the point is that with data, we need insight. And then the insight allows us to have a story. And then once we have a story, we can really now perform and drive performance through the data. We'll come back to this again later. So I went through the rough explanations in terms of what do we mean by data, what do we mean by storytelling, and what do we mean by data storytelling. So I won't go over that again. We can move on. So there are all sorts of different kind of data. So we have hard data, which typically are quantifiable, they're numbers. We have soft data, which can be in the form of word, and then also some medium data, which can also be pictures and observations. So data is really around what we can observe and what we can use to conclude, to come to insight, and they're not always in the form of numbers. So the next page here, I mean, unfortunately, this doesn't work very well as a still, as it works best as an animation. Having said that, what you can see here is that this is a physics experiment. And when the line is removed, the balls roll. And we used it to try to illustrate the concept of introducing a new product and imagining that the one that gets to the end of the line first is the most successful, the one with the that captures the most customers at the fastest pace. And we could move on to the next slide. And when it plays out, what we find out is that there is an order to their performance. In other words, there is an optimal path. And the point here is that this is one of the things that we try to do with data, to understand what's optimal, what's best, what's the fastest route, what's the quickest way. And when we discover that, we're then able to apply it and to scale it. If we go on to the next slide, please. And what we can see here is that the pace of adoption of products vary. Once upon a time, the telephone took 75 years for 100 million users in the world, compared to the mobile phone, which took only 16 years. And if we fast forward to more recent times, Instagram, 2.5 years, all the way down to more recent case of ChatGPT, which took only 2 months to get to 100 million users. And this is interesting because what it shows is that there is insight around the speed at which things diffuse. And this was something that Everett Rogers defined really, really well using data, and forms the basis of the study that we're just going to walk through very briefly now. So the concept is clear, is that what he defined in data was that customers fall into particular categories: innovators, early adopters, early majority, all the way down to laggards. And there were some descriptions around these characteristics, which, if we go to the next slide, what you see is that the propensity to adopt is greater with the innovators, and you tend to get resistance with the laggards. So in other words, the first people to adopt tend to be the innovators, then the early adopters, then the early majority. And when we're introducing innovations into market, this concept can be quite useful. But how do we apply it, and what data could we use to really help us to bring insights into the process? And so what we see here is that actually, in a certain context, you can see those who have adopted the product being highlighted. So you can see that there's a reasonable level of adoption. As this particular scenario, the product works its way through the life cycle. If we look at the next scenario, what we see is actually a much more deeper adoption of the product. More customers have adopted the product as it works its way through the life cycle. And then the question is, why is that? What has driven that? How can we accelerate that? And what can we learn from that? There are different kinds of products in terms of where they fall in terms of when we're introducing products to market. And particularly here, we're looking at those that fall into the area of being either a blockbuster or discontinuous innovation. In other words, that they are different and they bring excitement to the market, and they have the possibility of transforming the market, both in terms of performance, but also in terms of adoption. So what we did was that we wanted to know, does this concept work within, in this case, the pharmaceutical and the medical technology market? And then we wanted to know if we could apply this concept to accelerate performance. So the first thing we did then was to try to understand, if we proceed, to try to understand how would we be able to basically replicate what Rogers had said. If we wanted to know the innovativeness of these doctors, what could we ask? How could we profile them? Maybe we would ask them on a scale of 1 to 5 if they were how innovative they perceive themselves to be. Or we could ask them, how do they rate their level of innovativeness? Which one of the following innovative categories best describes you? Or maybe we just ask them, how innovative do you think you are? None of these questions work. And the reason none of these questions worked was because this relied on the customer's self-reflection. And of course, egos get in the way. And when the question is asked, about 25% of people say that they're an innovator. But we know from extensive study that it's only 2.5%. So how do we get to the truth? And where does data come in here to allow us to gain insight? So the question that was used to uncover this was, if a promising new product is launched in this area or that area, really specific, when would you use it? Would you use it immediately? Would you use it soon after release? Would you use it after your peers have tried it, once it's in common use, or after it becomes a standard product? And the hypothesis was that this will tell us who's the innovator, early adopter, early majority, all the way down. If we move to the next. And what we see is that actually this was what we had anticipated would happen as we played it out. If we press on. So we ran the study with 18,000 data points. And what you see in the red is the classification according to Rogers, and in the gray bar was what came out with our 18,000 doctors. And what we found is that from 18,000 doctors, it is almost identical, very little variances on a very large sample. So at this point, we're feeling confident that we have a question that allows us to profile our customers really well, to gain insight and understanding into what we perceive to be their innovation category. And we tested that in different areas. So we tested it with their behavior around antidepressant, lipid regulator, and a range of different areas. And what we found is that unlike when we asked them, are you an innovator, where 25% of people are innovators, actually only about 2.5%. So 2%, when we round it up, were saying they were innovators, even on this large sample. And you can see all the other percentages are broadly falling in line. And at this point, we're feeling quite confident that we really have a way of profiling and getting the insights we require. And then what we did is that we just wanted to make sure maybe people just put down and that they just innovators everywhere. So we tested to say, if someone is an innovator, if we looked at other areas where they always innovators. And for this, if we look across, basically what this is saying is that 49% were always innovators, but sometimes 24% were early adopters, 13%, 7%. So what it simply is telling us is that this is not I'm an innovator for everything. Actually, it depends on the context, it depends on the situation, what category and where people fit. So then we need to understand, one is that if this is true, can we test it? Can we actually use it? And if we move forward a couple of slides, we were able to cross-check it with real life prescription data. In other words, this is the category that we think they fell into. How can we demonstrate that it's true? Is it really true? And so if we go forward, what we now have is our 18,000 put into the categories. And what we then did is that we were able to look at an innovative product that was launched 2 years ago. And we wanted to understand, what does the performance look like? What does it look like for the innovators, for the early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggard? In other words, on a per person basis, how much of this new product were they using? And you could see that it almost behaves as we would expect. And here, even more profound is that the yellow and the green demonstrate scenarios where actually they've actively switched someone. So in other words, they stopped what they're using and they changed them to this new arena. And you see, when you look at that, by the time you get to the laggards, we can't even find a trace of it. So actually what we're saying is that not only have we been able to demonstrate through analysis that there's a good match, actually, when we check it in terms of behavior, there's a very good match in terms of behavior. So next slide, please. And what this is saying is that we did a ratio within that space to say, if there's a product that's been on the market for 20 years versus the one that's been on the market for 2 years, and we did a ratio. So in other words, the lower your number, the higher the penetration of the new product. And you can see again, the pattern falls exactly as we would expect. Okay, so if we move forward, so the question is that how can we use this? Well, the first thing is, and probably I need to move through this pretty quickly. So the first thing is that we know that we can profile these customers. We're able to put them into categories, and those categories, if we go to the next slide, as we know, are innovators, early adopters, late majorities, and so forth. So we have a very good way of classifying and profiling and getting them into the categories. But how can we use it? What's the benefit of this? If we say that we've got data, a way of profiling, we think that that data brings us insight, how does it allow us to tell story, to drive performance in a way that's going to be positive? So if we go to the next slide. So we're launching a new product. At the launch of our new product, this new innovative product, we know that the secret to our success is going to be dependent on us working our way from the innovators and the early adopters across the group over the life cycle of the product. This is the fastest path that drives the highest market share gain. So we can apply that in a practical way. If we go to the next slide, please. So across it, we're going to drive the greatest number of performance. Next slide, please. If a competitor was launching an innovative product into the market and we wanted to disrupt, we wanted to slow them down, we wanted to make sure that they didn't get as fast or as deep a diffusion as they would like, where would we focus our attention? We would be defending in the category that makes the difference. And one important point I'd like to bring our attention to here is that remember the question that uncovered our innovators and our early adopters. The innovators said they will use it immediately. But remember the early adopters. The early adopters said we will use it after after the peers have tried it. That means that if the peers don't try it, if the peers don't give the positive affirmation, then they don't use it. And then that's an opportunity there. If we go to the next use case, after this one. So the third case here would be a product is in the latter stages of its life cycle. It's really coming to the end of its cycle. And again, this gives us an opportunity to understand what segments to talk to. These are the groups that said after it becomes a standard product, once it's in common use, this is their driver. So actually for this group, they are not attracted by innovation. They're attracted by the opposite of innovation. So in other words, what's going to attract this group is that they are going to be able to use a product that is well and truly tested, and they know that they're going to be able to rely on. Okay, if we could press on. And then across the board, we can gain insight into the specific categories. So the ability to understand, to organize the data allows us to be able to gain additional insight. And the final point is that the secret to success of a disruptive innovation is really about this ability to cross the chasm and knowing where the chasm is, the critical players in the chasm allows us to focus resourcing, messaging, and approach to ensure that we really maximize what we're able to do there. Okay, we could press on. Okay, and now here, just briefly, I'll just share, this was a case study, and what this case study is showing is that this organization launched a product and we reviewed their strategy 2 years after. What they had here was a well-defined strategy, target A, B, C, A being the most prominent, then B, then C. These were based on the potential. How much patients did they see? Could they prescribe? And across, you could see the number of calls. So, 15% of people in target A had no calls at all, and 12% had 11 to 15 calls, and so forth. And you can see the breakdown. And if you wanted to optimize this, you would say, well, probably they need to stop seeing people more than 16 times, and they need to use some of that resources to see some of the target A and B more than 0 and 1 to 2 times, for example. But if we go to the next slide, I want to demonstrate. Now, because of what we've discussed and what we've been able to demonstrate with data is that we then took this data set and we said, well, actually, why don't we reclassify them? Let's give them night vision glasses for them to be able to see these customers as we see them. And so when we played that out, if we go to the next slide, what we're able to see is that we could put them into categories. So in other words, the target changes, and now we have innovators, early adopters, and early majorities, and so forth. And then what we see here is that these groups show different results. So first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that breakthrough innovation, a blockbuster, clearly the innovators and the early adopters from what we've studied up until now are the most critical ones. What we find is that 48% of innovators and 46% of early adopters had received no calls at all from the sales team. Now, is this deliberate? It's not deliberate. The reason why they'd received no calls is because this organization did not have that perspective. They lacked the data, they lacked the insight. And because they lacked the data and the insight, they operated on the basis of what they could see. Had they known all of the wasted resources on late majority and laggards, remember, we'll only use the product after it becomes a standard product, once it's in common use. But if we don't have the innovators and the early adopters adopting the product, how does it get into common use? And you can see, if we go back to the physics illustration that we showed earlier, how you can follow a suboptimal path. That means that the product launch, the adoption performs significantly less than it has the potential to. And data, if for anything, reveals truths and it enables us to optimize. And so there are further examples here. So without data, we have no insight, and it's the foundation of insight. And whether it's around the way Netflix decides what to offer us, what to show us, what to bring to our attention, or whether it's around the way Spotify and the like put together playlists, or indeed Amazon with their algorithmic commerce, where actually not only do they try to decide and offer what they think we may be most interested in, but more interestingly, as time goes along and they understand us better, they actually can decide for us. And the concept of this algorithmic commerce really being about the fact that they have such deep understanding of us as a customer that they know what we want before we even realize it. And then they present us with it. And of course, because it's based on good data and good insight, we adopt it. It's really removing friction from the buying process. And likewise, when we think about it from an emotional connection point of view, emotion indeed connects, but data validates. So we lead with facts, but we engage with feeling. And the story of the Real Women, Real Beauty campaign that Dove led, which was based on really good quantitative and qualitative research, but executed in a very emotional way that was a very engaging and successful campaign. And likewise, the way Airbnb also used data around community and understanding of how people interact, their preferences, to really engage their customers. We rely on data because certainty is rare. in data, we trust. Data helps us to manage risks, to navigate change, and to find clarity. So if we come back to the numbers that we started with, and I was saying that at the beginning that in one context, these are a bunch of numbers. In one context, the customers are target A, target B, until we put on our glasses to give us insight. And then we realize that actually, no, they're not just customers. There are innovators, early adopters, and there will be different contexts where we need a different lens of understanding our customers. This base insight and understanding from the basis of us being able to engage them with the right story, with the right engagement. So if we go to the next slide, so the story around these numbers is that actually, when organized differently, these numbers tell a story about a year in which there are 365 days, where there are 52 weeks, where there are 12 months, which some of the months have got 28 days, some of them have got 30 days, and of course, some I've got 31 days. This is a very good illustration of how data can lead to insight, and the insight allows us to tell a story. The future of data is been driven really by five big trends. One is really about the AI revolution and the integration of AI to be able to craft real time narrative and to be able to manage significant data sets and to draw insights from it. Hyper personalization is a key driver. And one of the key things here is that because of increased ability of processing, because of customer expectation, customers increasingly expect that we're able to meet their needs more precisely. The stories need to be adapted, they need to be specific, and they need to talk to them. Ethical storytelling and data privacy is critical, especially in this age. And all of a sudden, transparency, being true, is going to become more critical. And then using interactive tools to be able to tell the story, to be able to understand what's going on for our internal use, but then also to be able to use that as inspiration to drive things forward. And just finally, this point about emotions. There's more to data than the quant as we talked about. So sophisticated sentiment analysis, emotional intelligence, really getting data that's beyond what we're told, but a lot around what we observe, what we can see, and what we can sense. So data-driven storytelling is no longer optional. It's critical capability that distinguishes market leaders from followers, driving deeper connection, faster innovation uptake, and exceptional return on investment. To navigate the future, marketers must blend data precision with narrative mastery, turning insights into stories that resonate, persuade, and perform. So I'll close with these five summary points. So one is about revelation. Without data, marketing is guesswork, expensive guesswork. And really, data is the foundation that really allows us to get to revelation, and revelation being understanding of the truth. Insights are always there. We uncover them. It's like mining. The minerals are there. We just extract them. And similarly with insight is this point around making sure that we have the data to allow us the revelation. The second point is about clarity. In times of uncertainty, when change is accelerating at the pace that we all appreciate it is, data provides clarity, confidence, and control. And often what I say to my team is there's a difference between thinking and knowing. And when it comes to execution, that difference is vast. We want to know. Third point is around need. Data reveals customers' need before customers can even articulate them. I would add to that to say, not just before customers can articulate them, but sometimes customers cannot articulate them. They'll never be able to articulate them. We have to tease it out. We have to understand it before and because they are unable to do so. The fourth point is personal. Customers no longer tolerate irrelevant messaging. We increasingly need to get down to segment, dynamic segment, and even down to a personal level. And just as a closing point is that it's about being competitive. And that means that the companies leveraging data-driven approach effectively, they generate higher return on investment. It drives performance. It drives deeper connection with our customers. And in this future environment for sales and marketing, this is the approach that will give us the greatest return. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that section. That was power pack. That was very very educating. Thank you very very much. As somebody who leads a team of data analysts around marketing, we get to see this a lot. We also get to experience access to certain kind of data that by the time you're talking to marketers around even their markets, sometimes they are very, very surprised. And this is actually very power pack in terms of the example you gave regarding the early adopters and the innovator. We've seen that quite a lot. I have a question before I go to the comment section. Please drop your questions. If you have questions, please drop your question in the comment section. We will take as many as possible. I promise you that we still have a couple of time. We'll take as many questions as possible. That I promise you. But before I go, you mentioned the need for marketers to be able to get the right kind of insight they need from the data that they have. But we understand that in our markets, especially for those of us who operate within Africa, Nigeria in particular, one of the biggest challenge we have is access to the right kind of data. That's one of the biggest challenge that we have discovered in this market. And in some instances, where marketers have access to the data that they need, the ability to gather to get the kind of insight that is needed without becoming a data analyst. You have a lot of things you are doing already. There's so much on your table in terms of driving sales and driving the marketing efforts. Now having to sit down and having to analyze it, so much data is something again a lot of marketers are going to struggle with, because again you can spend so much time on the data, and at the end of the day the your core jobs still remain the ability to drive sales, right? So I have a question. So, how can marketer, especially for those of us who operate within the African ecosystem, how can we get access to the right kind of data that we need? Again, what are the kind of data that we should even be collecting in the first instance, without also, collecting the data, also being aware that there's data privacy, which is becoming a thing, a major thing in Nigeria and in Africa by and by. So how can marketer operating in Africa have access to the right kind of data that is needed?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a fair question. It reminds me, in many ways. First thing I would say is that I remember an old friend of mine once said to me that, look, I can't remember the context, but he was saying to me that whenever a man wakes up, that's his morning. And in many ways, I think that what we have to remember here, this is about a journey, right? It's about a journey. It's about moving forward from where we are, wherever that starting point is. That's the first point. The other thing I would say is that you are right in the sense that obviously maybe some of what I've shared sounds like this elaborate, sophisticated data gathering and analytics. But I think in many ways, sometimes the most important point there is the eye of the marketer to understand and to be able to develop good hypotheses, to be able to see what could be, and for that to inspire what data they may need. And to that point, some of you may know ID Anang. I remember about must be a good 15 years ago now, I had an exchange with him on marketing, and he told me a story about how he solved some issues around understanding market share in the market where there was no access to data, and I presume even less so in the days that he was referring to. And what he had explained to me was that they really tried to understand how could they understand what was happening with the share. And what they did is that they paid a sample of nightclubs for people to collect the tops of the bottles that were being opened, and they used that sample that was collected on a weekly basis to be able to understand what was happening with market share. I suppose what I'm saying, which is maybe a little bit contradictory of some of what I've shared, is that the most important part around this is not the data, it's the eyes of the marketer. it's the hypothesis, it's the insight, it's the understanding that the marketer has. And then maybe it's not possible to get the most elaborate data set, but if we have the right hypothesis, we can always use proxies. And I would only say that a lack of access to elaborate or sophisticated platform should not ever be an excuse for not being data driven. We have to be data driven with what data we have access to, and then we build from there.
Okay, good one. Then let me take this question from Amos Oladele. So Amos is asking, as a communicator, again, I said this earlier, as a communicator of skill to understand and interpret data effectively with, so how, basically he's asking how can he upskill and interpret data effectively without becoming a full-blown analyst? Again, looking at juggling so many things at the same time.
Yeah, no. So I think again, I think it's a good question. So to my mind, I think that if I think about a great marketer, if I think about an effective marketer, I think about someone who's got immense curiosity, immense amount of curiosity. A marketer to me is someone who always wants to understand why, who's curious, who's always hypothesizing about what could be going on. I think that number one is feeding this curiosity. So often I run sessions, workshop on customer centricity. One of the key questions I ask groups when I get into, let's say, workshop with them, I would typically say, what was the last thing you discovered about your customer? And then when they answer it, I'll ask when that was. And then if they say it was a year ago, right? I often would say to them, do you think that nothing has changed concerning your customer in a year? I think that my suggestion would be that we start from the curiosity end. We start from the desire. We start from the hypothesis end. And then we then need to find, okay, how can I understand this? How can I prove this? How can I demonstrate this? And then we build from there. And then I think that what we'll find is that when the hypothesis and the curiosity is there, the journey to solving and answering the question will get better and better with time. I think the base foundation that's required is curiosity.
Absolutely, I agree with you that the base foundation is curiosity. Thank you so much. Going to the comment section. I have a comment here from Alex. Okay, Alex is saying he loves. He said he loves your definition on and terms on data storytelling. Okay. Well, let's see. Oh, Victor is asking if this is going to be on YouTube after this. Absolutely, I want to believe that the marketing team will upload this to upload this online after the section. So please just check on their website again. You'll be able to have that. Dr. Remy is saying thank you for the stimulating section. Then Alex again, as shown during the presentation, there was a need to change the question in. Okay, so basically just giving comment. I want to say a very big thank you, Mr. Baba Awopetu, for your section and for your time this morning. It's been very educational for most of us that join in. Thank you very much once again for joining us this section, and we hope to have you sometime soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.